put enormous resources and effort and commitment into creating a major scientific base.
Pen Hadow.
Pen Hadow is an Arctic region explorer,
Advocate, adventurer, and guide.
He is the only person to have trekked solo and without resupply by third parties.
From Canada to the geographic North Pole.
I don't think that Russia is going to continue in its expansionist mode for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Antarctica for me is dull. 35% of sea level rise globally is due to just the upper layer of the ocean. That the countries that are most vulnerable to military occupation are...
It's a great pleasure to be here for the Redefined One Club podcast. As most of you probably did, we woke up to a very sunny and a very cold day today. And as I got out of bed and took the dog for a walk at 5:45 this morning, I cursed Mother Nature and the rest of the earth as I was battling -5 degrees. And I thought to myself, well, hang about, who's the guy I'm interviewing today? And very quickly, I thought myself much of a, I don't know if I can say this word, it begins with P and ends in Ussi. When I thought, well, Pen Hadow has had to deal with slightly colder temperatures than that. Now, I'm a tropical man, so you won't find me going anywhere near Arctic or the Antarctic. And I'd like to ask Pen, first question, where does this adventure, where did this thirst for adventure actually begin?
Well, as they say, it's been a journey. One thing that I could sort of point to, because I would say that there's been a cocktail of ingredients that have led to me leading the life that I've led, and that cocktail of influences has changed over time. So what was motivating me at one stage of my life was not necessarily the same. Oh, really?
Really?
Well, hello. Right. So would you like me to recap? Was that helpful for your
Yes, please. Good idea.
audience? Okay, so what has influenced me in making the decisions that I've made over the last 60 years or so, that cocktail influences has changed over time. So what drove me to do certain things in my 20s, that is not the same as what is driving me now. And I would actually go further and say that I now realise, looking back, when I reflect on some of the decisions I made and the reasons that I made them, the reason that I thought, the influences I thought were key weren't necessarily the ones that were actually driving those decisions. We might come on to that a little bit later. It may sound a bit odd to say that, but that's how it actually was for me. Willard Price. Do we have any readers of Willard Price?
Yeah, right here. Right here.
Biddy, you're the man. Excellent. Well, that's a bit of it. Has anyone else ever heard of a Willard Price? Okay, so he was writing in the sort of 1890s to the 1920s, that sort of a thing. And he wrote a series of books called, and the two star characters were Hal and Roger. And they were brothers, as I recall, don't think they were cousins, and they were always getting up to stuff like African adventure and lion adventure and Arctic adventure. And that was the first series of books I'd ever read as a young boy, aged, I suppose, 8, 9, 10, something like that. And they led into, in later life, in my 20s, I sort of moved up to Wilbur Smith. I'm sure some of you have read or heard of Wilbur Smith, a major writer of sort of African adventures, if you like, in southern Africa mainly. So I'm not a great reader, but as you will discover, actually it is books that have been one of the big influences in my life. So not very many, but what I've read seems to have really counted in forming who I was. I could take you back one step further if you like.
Please do, absolutely.
So really, another key influence in what led to me becoming a sort of polar person would be that when Captain Robert Falcon Scott, who also known as Scott of the Antarctic, can we have a show of hands who has heard of Captain Scott? Excellent. Okay, great. He found himself in a race to be the first person to reach the South Geographic Pole against a Norwegian called Roald Amundsen. And actually, Scott reached the pole 6 weeks after Amundsen did. Found Amundsen's tent at the South Pole, so there was no doubt he'd come second. In a race that Scott had never actually wanted or planned for, but found himself, due to the secrecy of what was going on with Amundsen, who just suddenly sprung it upon him at the last possible minute. Anyway, Scott reached the pole and started to make his way back, and as many of you will know clearly, he died in his tent with two of his remaining sledging partners. And they died just 11 miles short of a major resupply base that they'd set up on their way from the coast up to the pole at the top of the polar plateau, or now on their way back. And as he lay dying, he was writing letters to his sponsors, his family, his friends, and we think that the last letter he was writing was to his wife, Kathleen Scott. And he kept adding paragraphs between the letters that he was writing to other people. And one of the paragraphs said, "Get the boy interested in the natural world." There are some schools that see that as more interesting than competitive sport. And also, keep him in the fresh air, you know that's a good thing, was another sentence that he added there. Scott had one child called Peter, and he was 3 when his father died. And this letter, along with his other letters, all enclosed within his journal, which is very famous, actually one of the top 10 items held at the British Library, is Captain Scott's journal. That letter was, that journal and the tent and Scott's body was found 9 months after he died. And after the winter, they went to see if they could find what had happened to this travelling party. And the letter made its way back to Kathleen Scott, the mother, eventually. And she took it upon herself. She's a very extraordinary woman in her own right. Ministers of State sought her counsel. Well, we think in the 1910s, 1920s, women were not generally, you can imagine that was quite a thing for a woman to be consulted informally by ministers of state for advice. She was in the Bloomsbury set, she was an intellectual Bloomsbury set type and a sculptress. And she took it upon herself to A, toughen Peter up to the cold, and B, to introduce him to the natural world. So what I would say to you is that one of our greatest explorers of all time, who happened to be a polar explorer, Captain Scott, who should not be remembered so much really for dying on the way back, having come second in a race that he never wanted, which is the commonly held view of that's the story. Actually, he put enormous resources and effort and commitment into creating a major scientific, and the results, because no one went back to Antarctica for about 50 years after their expedition, that provided that what we would call the baseline data that climatologists and others use now. They found something like 2,500 different species of animal. You think, really, in Antarctica? Yeah, I mean, it was a huge project, and that's really his legacy, I would suggest. Anyway, first thing that Kathleen Scott did was to hire a nanny called Enid Wigley. And Enid was told to toughen Peter up, so put him through a Spartan regime in southern England of less and less clothing for longer and longer periods in the autumns, winters and springs outside. And this was done for 5 years. It has some quite interesting physiological and psychological effects on young Peter from the age of 3 to 8 years old. She also, amongst many things, introduced Peter to, when he was 15, to the director of the Natural History Museum, and the director would take him off on expeditions in the holidays, young Peter, to learn about the natural world. So you can see the mother, Kathy, was pretty focused on following through on the dying words of one of our greatest explorers to the most important person in the next generation, his son, his only child, Peter. Next question is, do you know, who knows Peter? We've got a nod here.
I think so.
Go on, I'm sure you're right, but yes.
Yeah.
So Peter Scott, who became Sir Peter Scott, was a most remarkable man. He represented Britain in Great Britain in two different disciplines at the Olympics. He was a sailor and he was a clay pigeon shot. He was a brilliant painter. He was a brilliant naturalist. He set up the WWF, world's largest environmental organization now by membership. He designed the logo, now one of the top 10 logos recognized in the world, the panda. That was his design. And he was the chairman and chief exec for the first 10 years of the WWF. He also, as a last throwaway line, just to make the point, the genetics going on in that household were phenomenal, I believe. He also was the first person to present natural history on television, anywhere. And guess who he handed over to from his programme Look?
David Attenborough.
Yes, sir, David Attenborough. So the baton was handed on over to David. Now, the reason I'm telling you all of this is because my posh voice gives it away. Manid no, sound posh? We've had this discussion.
We have.
Because we both come from Harrow, but different ends of Harrow.
Completely different ends of Harrow, thank you very much.
So, so my point is that my father, when he was a small boy, he was looked after randomly by Enid Wigley. Enid was 18 when she was taken on to look after Peter. Her next job was looking after my father when he was a little boy. My father took her on in her 70s to look after me, because she was a spinster all her life, and he just wanted to look after her. So she was my notional nanny or governess, which makes it sound far grander than it was. We lived in a small rectory in the middle of nowhere in Scotland. And I was put through this Spartan regime of less and less clothing for longer and longer periods, and was toughened up to the cold. So you're starting to think, hang on a minute, there's a connection here, maybe, with what I did in later life, and there really is. But Enid was the connecting theme. Looking after me, and previously my father, but then Scott's son. So that is kind of the sort of the soil in which I was grown, nurtured as a child.
If I'm not mistaken, that kind of continued when you went to Harrow School. You had a particular interest and passion in physical activity. You were captain of the football team, captain of the rugby team. And then, if research is correct, you did something called the Long Ducker, which is a 20-mile run from Harrow on the Hill to Marble Arch. Now,
and back.
And back. Okay, so I did Harrow on the Hill to Marble Arch in 45 minutes flat, but I changed it at Bond Street, everyone.
Very wise.
And apparently you're the first person that was recorded doing so in 1977.
Yeah, so, so I went to Harrow School on Harrow on the Hill, and there was this sort of myth, legend, that there was a thing called Long Ducker, and it was this run, as described, which is basically down the hill, get onto the Grand Union Canal, run down the Grand Union Canal, get up at Little Venice onto the Edgware Road, run down Edgware Road to Marble Arch, through the gates, turn round and come back, retrace your steps. And some senior boys had said, I was 15 at the time, I went to Harrow when I was 13. By the time I was 15, several boys who I'd rather looked up to in the school and in my house would say, yeah, we'll do, before we leave, we'll do Long Ducker, it's kind of, none of them did. And I thought it's a bit of a red rag to bull, really. I thought that's really poor, that form, that you should sort of imply that you can do all this stuff, let all the junior boys know, but actually never do it. So I decided I would, and I did. And the headmaster, on the Monday morning after, I ran it on the Sunday, and the headmaster in front of the school assembly said, just thought you'd all like to know that Hadow did this, ran this Long Ducker, and we can't find anyone having done it for 50 years, which was a bit of a shock, because that tells you everything you need to know about a certain sort of Harrovian, that they bullshit their way through various things. And then they hired a researcher about 10 years later to find out who was the first person to do it, and it turns out no one had ever done it, never. So suddenly it was announced, Pen Hadow was actually he's the only person who's done it. And in fact, they then set it up as a big school thing. So every boy at Harrow, for about the last 20 years, has had to do at least, they get taken down by a bus to the Marble Arch. Am I seeing a nodding Harrovian there? I am. You really hate me? You read about it?
I'm from Eastern Europe, so.
Okay, good decision.
Lucky dodge.
Yeah, lucky dodge. So anyway, so everyone had to do half of it, and once you went to the sixth form, you were allowed to do the whole thing, and it became a huge thing for many years.
So fast forwarding now into your role as a polar explorer.
Yeah.
North Pole or South Pole, which came first? Which did you get to first?
So you might think that with my whole sort of connection with the Scott family that I'd be interested in the Antarctic. Basically, I used to work at a sports managing agency called Mark McCormack Sports Organisation, IMG, International Management Group, which was the dominant global marketing agency for sports stars and sports events. And it's a pretty cool job on the face of it, but I wasn't really geared up for it. Long story short version. So in the lunch breaks, I used to go to the Royal Geographical Society sometimes, walk across Hyde Park, have a read. And I picked out a book. The short version is, I read this book in a lunchtime, and I was so amazed by what I read about this chap called Bernard Adolf Hansch, who no one's ever heard of. He was a German ornithologist, but he did this indescribably tough journey across Baffin Island in about 1910, which was roughly the time the South Pole and the North Pole were being reached for the first time by anybody. This is up in northeast Canada, sort of right, the big island, looked like a bit like a large banana just to the left, the west of Greenland's west coast, above mainland Canada. And I just thought, this chap's life should be celebrated. No one really knows about this. I don't care that he's not famous. In fact, that kind of suited me. I just wanted to honour his effort. He died on his expedition eating a polar bear that poisoned him because they have very high levels of vitamin A, I think it is, from memory, and that can literally kill you. And they also have something called trichinosis worm, which is what pigs have, which is why everyone's so concerned you have to cook pork well because of the worms, there's trichinosis worm in it, which bears have. So anyway, he died, and I thought I must honour his work, and he'd been mapping the fauna and flora of the whole of Baffin Island, single-handed. And there again was baseline measurements. And the real value was to then go back almost exactly 100 years later and look at the fauna and flora and then say, oh, okay, these are the changes that have been going on. There are none of these plants here, they've all moved further north or what have you. So it was giving value to his work. And in that lunchtime, I walked back across Hyde Park and I resigned from my job. Boom, reading that one book.
Then soon after that?
I was so that was autumn of '88, and by spring of '89 I made my first expedition crossing the archipelago of Svalbard, not doing a full crossing of it, but Spitsbergen is the big island to the west of this sort of group of islands that are just on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, due north of Norway by about 600 miles from the pole. And I went with one other guy who was like my mentor for 70 days, one-on-one mentoring on really how to survive in the polar environment, how to operate in any remote environment, and basically be safe and achieve whatever it is that is your objective, which is one of the key things to understand when you're very isolated and a very long way from any sort of help or rescue if you get into trouble. So that was the start of my Arctic life. And to be honest, I have trekked to the South Pole once on a new route with a sledging partner in 2001, over the winter of 2000, 2001. But Antarctica for me is dull. You know, it's pretty easy. Really.
Okay.
And it's all, you know, there are no bears, there's no animals. There are a few tiny bits around the coast where there's bare rock, and that's where the penguins are, so that's where the seals and the killer whales and everything else is. Everything congregates, these hot spots. But, you know, 99.9% of Antarctica, which is just a massive continent with a 1.25 mile nearly thick of ice, on average, 1.21 miles thick of glacial ice over the top of it. And it's inert, there's nothing going on there at all in terms of wildlife. So you're not going to get chased by anything. So where's the fun in that? And the ice is moving at about 10 or 20 meters in the more stable areas a year. Well, you know, and you're going in the summer because you have to, because the weather's so bad in the spring and the autumn and the winter. So it's a blinding light most of the time. You don't get any nice coloration because the sun's never low above the horizon or below the horizon. And it's just put your head down and go. How fit and mentally tough are you just to go? You can shut your eyes and walk for 600 miles, pretty much. The crevasse areas are all really known. If you ever fell in a crevasse in Antarctica, you really shouldn't be going out of your bedroom, let alone going to Antarctica, because they're mapped, they're known positions. So it just didn't appeal to me, whereas the Arctic Ocean is an ocean, just like any other ocean. It's just got this very thin film of ice, 2 to 3 meters thick, about my height. That's it. Super thin film of ice, moving around all the time. I moved 40 miles in 9 days, just sitting in my tent. seriously mobile, going in all sorts of directions, driven by winds, currents, and tides. So, and then you've got the bears. You've got the really low light, amazingly beautiful light that would last for 24 hours, lighting this, this crenellated surface of pressure ridges and ice flows. The whole thing is just infinitely more interesting and actually challenging.
So Pen, I'd like to ask you how you prepare for such an expedition. I mean, I've noticed 10 fingers, I'm assuming 10 toes.
Yes, and some. Yep.
10, okay.
I haven't got an 11th toe.
Right,
I just want to make that clear.
Okay.
No, but I'm fully intact.
Fully intact. Good to know, Pen.
Mark of a professional.
Thank you very much. And how does one prepare for such extreme conditions, both physically and mentally?
Well, I think the first thing to sort of say that that the Arctic Ocean and indeed Antarctica are not hostile environments. As long as you hold that thought that there is a hostile environment, you're kind of, in my view, you're pretty screwed, because your ego is so giant that it thinks that the environment has got it in for you and you. I'm going to do you. It's like, no, get over yourselves. Your ego, it doesn't know you're there. It's just going about its business, if you like. So don't flatter yourself that you're that important that it's going to get you. Which may sound like a bit of a fiddling with words, but actually there's a really profound understanding below that. So what I would say is, I'm happy to say that the Arctic Ocean, if you like, is inhospitable, but it's not actively hostile. It's passively inhospitable. Much of the writings that you will find, certainly by British explorers and many others, is, because it's done by men for the most part, is written in military language. We're going to conquer, the North Pole. You're being, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the words now, I'm getting too old, but, being attacked by the wind and all this sort of. If you read the language, it's very me or us against, let's call it, nature, and a battle of wills and all this. It's rubbish. There's another way of being, a different mindset, actually much more akin to the Inuit and Eskimo who live up there, which is that you've got to find ways of working with it, understanding why it's behaving in certain ways, and what that might mean for you, and what it might now, and what it might mean for you in a few days' time, and it's just snow, for example, creates one of the best insulating substances known to man. Those igloos, they have one candle in an igloo, and that can and the people are in t-shirts or topless in their shorts in these igloos. It's incredibly insulating material. So rather than seeing it as a nasty, weird stuff that's just cold and best kept out of the tent, I started to think, no, actually, it's got all sorts of benefits. It's also a free supply of fresh water, which is kind of weird on an ocean. I don't know if you know any other oceans that have got fresh water. In fact, at certain times of the year, you can dip a cup into the top of the Arctic Ocean between the ice floes, and you can drink the water. Because the ice flows over time, over 2 years or so, they extrude all the salts out of the ice flows. All the salts in salt water, which isn't just sodium chloride, it's loads of other chemicals. They all get basically pushed out of the bottom of the sea ice or up through the top, and they end up being drinkable. You can melt older sea ice. It's fresh water. So, and then when they melt, then you've got this very thin layer of fresh water on the top of an ocean. I could go on for hours about all the sort of weirdnesses and differences. Some would say the Arctic Ocean, the Arctic environment, is trying to kill you, because our body temperatures are like plus 37 degrees, right? We're all happy at plus 37. Trust me, if you go below plus 35, you are heading into difficult territory. If you go down to plus 33, you're about to die, right? So if the temperature of the air, what we would call the ambient air temperature, never mind all this rubbish about wind chill, which is another whole story but just ambient, actual air temperature, if it's minus 40 and you're trying to be plus 37, there's a 77 degree temperature problem there. You're trying to keep at 37, and it's trying to drag you down to minus 40. I say it's trying to, but in effect. So right there, you can see you're mainly made of water. Water freezes at 0. The biggest effect of those very cold temperatures is on brain function. Mm-hmm. That's the real problem. That's kind of the real problem that most people, I believe, don't really understand when they're doing these polar expeditions.
I mean, you're going to have significant periods of solitude, right? You're going to
Yeah.
be alone with
Yeah.
your own thoughts for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So psychologically, possibly the only unusual thing about me is that I'm very relaxed on my own for long periods of time. If you said to me tomorrow, Pen, I'm afraid you've got to go somewhere for 6 months on your own, really wouldn't faze me. Well, depending on where it was, I suppose. But basically, going up to the Arctic, whatever, happy as a lamb. Come back. Next night, the day I'm back, I go into a dinner party, and you'd never know. I wouldn't be having a freak out or anything. I'd just be chatting away normally. So I think that's quite an unusual mental setup, which I just happened to have discovered. The big problem, okay, there are some 2 huge challenges which are not really ever made explicit in doing these sorts of very tough expeditions in very cold environments. The first is the effect of cold on your brain. Basically, you have hypothermia within a few hours, and you're then going to be hypothermic for in the minus 35-ish bracket. So you're thinking very slowly and sluggishly. It is very similar to being drunk. In effect, I was drinking a litre to a litre and a half of whiskey or vodka a day.
Sounds excellent.
Yeah, happy days. Unfortunately, you know, obviously, I don't take any alcohol at all. But that's how your brain is working, really slowly. So there's a high likelihood you're going to make mistakes. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're a yachtsman bouncing around on the ocean waves, it is the freak wave that happens, and if you happen to not be on deck or have got the sail set the right way, you're going to have a bad time. But in these cold environments, any mistake for just a minute or so, you will feel the effects. Okay. The water in your surface skin will freeze, and it will just freeze deeper and deeper. And basically, that's the water in your cells and between your cells and your blood as well. So what happens when water freezes? It expands. So as the water in your cells freeze, it bursts the cell wall, end of cell. So that is now necrotic tissue. And the deeper that freezing process goes, the deeper the necrotic tissue. And the problem is, in other words, frostbite. And the problem with that is the infection sets in where the clean, fresh skin underneath, the interface with that and this dead tissue, that's where the infections start, and that's where the real pain and problems are. So many people in not appreciating that the real problem is that you're not going to be thinking well, and you will absolutely, if make any mistakes, you will be get frostbite. Well, that's kind of the end of the expedition for you. The mental effort required to not make any mistakes, knowing that you're almost certainly going to because of this whole situation, that is really, really draining. And knowing all the different things that could go wrong in any hour or any day, given the sort of environment, climate that you're working in, weather you're working in, that's exhausting. And the other high-level challenge that's not made explicit, if you're on your own particularly, is managing your emotional state. So you might be amazed that I went from being, during the course of the 75 days it took, I was out there on my successful solo project, angry, ecstatic, joyful, miserable, murderous. I mean, the full spectrum of human emotions. You think, well, how on earth? I mean, there's no one up there to get wound up about. What on earth's going on? And the trick is your brain seems to find, it reacts to situations that do happen. It's like, oh my God, the sea ice conditions are terrible. You're going to only for 8 hours, you're only going to cover half a mile. You have 3 more days of this. You're not going to reach the pole. How unfair is that? Well, hang on. Who are you saying is being unfair? God? I mean, who are we talking to here? But it messes with your mind. Antarctica doesn't in the same way. You just put your head down and go. But the ice moving around in different directions, often the wrong direction, is really mentally challenging. So the skill is to know how, in very specific technical terms, have methods, processes that you can use to stabilize your emotional state. Okay, I'm feeling like that. That's understandable in the circumstances, but it's not helping. So archive it, okay, understood, but I've got to get the yacht, the mast back up and going along happily, if you like. And that is very wearing, but those two things are, in my view, the ultimate challenges for a polar solo operator.
Thank you, Ben. Now, moving from solo to an expedition,
Yeah.
could you tell me what the differences are between the two? In particular, you led the first all-women expedition. I believe there were 20, there was an all-female team of 20 to the North Pole, is that correct?
Well, yeah, it was an all-women expedition, and this was 1997, and it was pre the sort of gender fluidity.
Okay.
So it wasn't Penelope Hadow that set off on this by alter ego, or was it? Okay. Back in 1995, I really felt strongly that the men were pulling the wool over the eyes of women. That this was an environment that really only men could or should be operating in. You know, preferably hairy chests, preferably ex-special forces, preferably this, that, and the other. And we kind of psyched women out of it. And I just thought, this is just actually wrong. So I put an advertisement in did a PR in the Daily Telegraph. We had 350 women apply from around Britain, from 18-year-olds to 65-year-olds, people with double mastectomies, people who are students. We had a mother and a daughter. We had someone from the royal family. We had a Royal Protection Squad officer, quite randomly. We had, international hockey players, a whole spectrum. And of those, we whittled them down, and they whittled themselves down to 20. And they were led then by the 20 British women, led by 2 Canadian women guides. So I was sort of behind the scenes orchestrating it and raising the money largely, but they did it, and it turned out to have quite an interesting impact really on women's. If I don't want to make myself, it's the women who did the journey, but I would say that was a watershed moment for women and adventure, and what they realised, if I can put it like that they could do, whether it's rowing oceans and all sorts, going up Everest. It was a moment. It wasn't intended. It was just doing it really from a polar perspective. So, yeah.
Talking about your journey from being a polar explorer to a conservationist, that's quite a large leap.
Yeah. So,
how did that come about?
So when I reached the North Pole, because it took me 3 attempts over 15 years, 1994 I failed, in inverted commas, 1998, and then 2003 when I was successful, I had no plan. I kind of, in my mind's eye, my wife of the time used to say, Pen, you've got to have a backup plan. You've got to have a plan B. If you don't succeed again, you're going to be so miserable, and where is the money going to come from for our household? You've got to have a plan B, or you'll go, your head needs to have that comfort blanket, if you like. And my argument was, if I've got any comfort blankets at all, it's a way of chickening out. When you're up there, the pressures are so extreme. So I burnt all my bridges. So when I actually reached the pole, it was a moment of exquisite sort of satisfaction, if you like, but I had no idea what I was going to do, none. And so after 2 years of doing stuff related to my solo project afterwards, I thought, why don't we use the skills that people like myself have got, moving stages around, in this very difficult operating environment and find things out that the scientists would like to find out but don't have the resources or the skills to do themselves. So we'll deploy ourselves in their service. So I set up an international research program, ran for 3 years. We operated the only research facility on sea ice in the world, up in right on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, off the northernmost islands of northern Canada. And as we were doing that, and basically sort of monitoring and looking at the consequences of losing sea ice up there, which is sort of doomed at the moment to just melting away more and more each year, crudely, I thought there's no point just understanding the biodiversity of this region while knowing that they're just becoming more and more stressed by their habitat, because sea ice is a habitat. It's a very particular habitat. There's a whole raft of animals, many of whom you will know of, like, orcas, certain families of orcas, or pods of orcas, and walruses, and 3 types of seal, and obviously the bears, Arctic fox, surprisingly, and a few others, beluga, narwhal. All these animals, and much, much smaller ones, have, for all or part of their life cycle, grown to become dependent on sea ice being there. And I thought, if we don't start the protection process pretty quickly, it'll all have gone, and then we'll think, oh, we understood everything about that environment that no longer exists, that ecosystem. So I decided towards the end of that research process in 2012, right, how can we protect, safeguard this very delicately balanced ecosystem? So at that point, although I continue to support and fund science, because it's essential to provide the scientific arguments for any particular conservation measure you want to put forward, actually my real work is now about working with policymakers to get them to understand at this stage what the issues are and that there are solutions.
Because you actually have empirical evidence that the polar caps are melting. I mean, it's not something put forward by vegans and tree huggers. I've got no offense to vegans and tree huggers, but it is real.
Yeah, absolutely. So over the last 40 years, each decade, roughly from memory, it's about 11% of the sea ice cover, that lid, if you like, on the top of the planet, has melted. It reforms in the winter, but at the end of the next summer, it's a little bit smaller as an area that's left, that sort of residual amount at the end of a summer. And it's not if you're looking from your side, and this is the graph, it's not a straight line down, it's a sort of jagged line, but the track is very much downwards. And the volume of ice, as opposed to the area, which is what the satellites can see really well, if the area is like this, the volume is like this, much steeper angle. And that's kind of key to know how much longer we'll have ice. The Max Planck Institute, which is a sort of authoritative body, it forecasts that, I mean, you will have read in the papers that it's much reported that there'll probably be less than 10% sea ice on the whole of the Arctic Ocean, the whole of the Arctic, between 2030, well, that's 6 years away, no ice at all at the end of a summer, between 2030 and 2050. So we've got that's the spread. But what people aren't talking about, because it's awkward, a bit like that inconvenient truth, that by 2125, so that's basically 100 years from now, almost exactly, but it's not, roughly then, there won't be any ice at any time of the year. And if you think that that's quite interesting, I've put 2 things to you. First is, if the Daily Mail, the British press, reported that the colour of the moon, on the top of the moon was now looking yellow or red or green or blue, people would be freaking out as to what the hell was going on with our solar system, or what was going on. It's going on an hour and a half's flight from here, and people are going, oh, that's quite interesting. It's like, guys, that white protective, it's that white shield. It's like a protective heat shield. It reflects back the energy coming in, the sun's energy that comes in the springs, summers and autumns. If you don't have that, although to you and I, seawater looks shiny and glittery and reflective, it's not. You go from sea ice will reflect 80 to 90% of all energy back into space. Doesn't even touch the sides. If you take that away, it absorbs 80 to 90%. So you've got like an 80% gain in the amount of energy absorbed. 35% of sea level rise globally is due to just the upper layer of the ocean expanding as it warms up. Thermal expansion of a liquid, or fluid, as you may have back at school. It's kind of almost impossible well, it is impossible to overstate what changes that will bring about over the next 100 years.
What changes would they be? What are the consequences?
Well, we're talking about weather experienced in different locations throughout the northern and indeed the global environment. Northern hemisphere, including us, of course, right down to the tropics. We're talking about sea levels rising. The biggest contributor and the biggest unknown, but it's at the moment just getting faster and faster and faster with no obvious reason why it will get slow down, is that the ice on Greenland, it's like it's an ice sheet, just a smaller version of Antarctica, is melting. So getting water that's above, outside of the bath, if you like, now being melted and being put in the bath, so the water level goes up. That's going to make, potentially a meter's difference. It could go a meter higher than they were forecasting, even in the International Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC reports of 10 years ago are looking seriously outdated now because there wasn't enough evidence that everyone could agree to. So sea level rise will be one of the outcomes of this warmer northern hemisphere. If I can just, I don't want to get too sort of technical about this, but it's kind of why my reason for my existence now is to try and sort of help people to see and understand why the Arctic, which when I started in the 1980s, it was like a few nutters went around pulling sledges for their own glorification, including people like me. Well now, and it was like irrelevant, infertile and pointless. Well now, I would say it's super geopolitically sensitive up there for all sorts of reasons, including resources. It's hugely more fecund and productive in terms of biology, and ironically, it's also got a point, not pointless. It's got one of the three of the most famous points on the planet. You've got the South Pole, Mount Everest, and the North Pole. So, where am I going with this round? Oh, I just want to say, so the big circulation of the atmosphere, kind of weather therefore, is that it warms up on the equator. The air sitting on the land and over the sea warms up so it gets less dense and it rises. And then it basically tracks up or down to Antarctica, or it tracks up towards the North Pole at a high level. And as it approaches the pole, it cools down so it sinks. And then in those snazzy patterns you may remember at school on the globe, the sort of herringbone of wind patterns makes their way back to the tropics and the equator, and then it carries on. So you've got this big cycle, and that whole cycle is driven by the temperature difference, the coldness of the North Pole and the warmness at the equator. Well, if you start to warm up the North Pole, which is what's happening and is going to accelerate, the temperature difference, and therefore the pressure difference, which is really what drives the air, is going to get weaker and weaker, flabbier and flabbier. It's just got no, just losing its oomph. That's the sort of giant scale stuff that is already happening. You get these weird loops in the jet stream. We get weird weather for quite sustained periods of time in North America and in Europe, because it's sort of losing its way a little bit. It's not as crystal clear, So, and the exact same happens with the oceans as well. Well, a very similar thing happens with the oceans. So, sorry, I know I'm sounding like slightly ranty, but maybe because I care, and I want you to sort of see why all this stuff matters. It's not just a strange, weird, white place that's weird people go to.
So what can we do? The layperson, the person sitting at home, the person sitting in the audience.
Fund the 90 North Foundation.
Oh, I've heard of that.
I know we're very entrepreneurial spirited here. So I've set up a few businesses in my time. I set up the world's first guide service to the North Pole back in the day. I set up the first environmental sponsorship agency not so long ago, and now I've set up this charity called the 90 North Foundation, and its sole focus, and it has an end goal, is to essentially create the world's largest marine reserve, which is for the entire international waters area around the North Pole, and to protect it through conservation measures through the International Maritime Organization and one or two other bodies to protect it, because it's going to have a really rough time, and it needs to, basically a new ocean is being created, a newly accessible ocean. So you've now got mining industries coming in, you've got fishing industries, so they've got some new fishing areas for the first time, and you've got international shipping, who are already finding they're having to go back round Africa at the moment because of pressures on the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. The Panama Canal hasn't got much water left at the moment. It's got a huge problem there. So people are always looking for shorter routes, the cargo shippers. 90% of all goods in the world gets moved around by ships. There's a new route that absolutely will open up, and it's basically, they won't be heading south from, let's say, China and Shanghai as an example, Southeast Asia. They'll head north up through the Bering Strait between Alaska and Siberia, through that narrow 50-mile strait, which is an international strait, so anyone can do it, straight up from the far side up towards us, up to the North Pole, and then down, and then as they come past East Greenland, they'll split either right to the Port of New Jersey and the eastern seaboard of America, or left to Rotterdam and the European ports. And that is almost half the distance. So the moment the sea ice has gone for long enough in a year, each year, regular ships will be doing that route. Massive time savings, cost savings, to an area that's completely virgin of any human activity at all throughout human history, because no one could get ships up there, apart from the odd icebreaker.
So what is 90 North doing in terms of trying to change policies with respect to shipping? Because at the end of the day, you're going against huge commercial giants who want to save money, want to make transport efficient. How does 90 North, what is 90 North doing to affect this significantly?
So there's already a strong body of support for no fishing. Currently there's an agreement in place which almost won the sort of Nobel Peace Prize for its originality and extraordinariness, where the precautionary principle was applied at scale. Almost every country with fishing fleets has signed up to it. I mean, China, America, Russia, South Korea, Japan. They were not going to fish at all in the international waters around the North Pole till 2037. It's a voluntary agreement, but that's the plan. So they all recognise that this is a very wobbly area, and in fact, if they strip the fish out of it, which they could do relatively quickly, that could kill off, that is thought to be the nursery ground for the major fisheries in the Northern Pacific and Northern Atlantic. So now they've really shot themselves in the foot. So there's lots of serious people in these key countries are up for a discussion about how do we conserve these waters. Mining, the good news is that there's very little oil or gas right at the top of the planet. There's a hell of a lot in the tundra of Canada and America and Russia, and there's actually probably quite a lot for the first 200 miles offshore. All the countries around the North Pole have been given 200 miles off their land to be for their own. It's called an exclusive economic zone. They can do what they like there, basically. We're looking at once again more than 200 nautical miles, and there's a region of about 3 million square kilometres roughly, which would make it by far the largest wildlife reserve, where the geology and the geomorph shape of the seabed suggest there's no oil or gas to speak of. And by the time people are really interested in doing that, there probably won't be much of a demand for oil and gas. So we're talking about many, many, many decades from now. So the last thing is the shipping, and a radical thought would be, actually, why not sacrifice the Central Arctic Ocean, this international waters, right at the top, because it's relatively low productivity. Let the ships do the most economic thing, because there's going to be enormous pressures to do so, and that will suck off the vessels that are currently going through the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea route through Canadian islands, because they can just about. Some of them are starting to do it, and Russia's always promoting a route along the top of Russia. So, and that is where most of the mammals are, the Arctic marine mammals are, in the coastal areas. So it would be a bold move, and it would need to be scientifically underpinned as being wise, but why not actually let them do, horror of horrors, come through these virgin waters, because that'll keep them away from where most of the marine mammals are. That would be a brave foundation but if that's what the science says, then that is the right thing to do.
And you have a target, don't you? You said that you have an end goal. You also have a time, like a year in mind, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yes, so 2037 there's 2030 because there's a whole movement internationally to try and get 30% of the global marine environment protected in some shape or form by 2030. Well, currently there's only about 7%. So that's a giant leap. But it is indicative of the massive concern that the big global bodies have for the loss of fish stocks and general biodiversity in the marine environment. It's just being hoovered up and no one's really caring, especially in the international waters. So there's 2030, and then there's the next date beyond that to actually complete, get an agreement in place to create this North Pole Marine Reserve, if you will, is 2037, because that's when the fishing agreement formally is due for a major review.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Pen, you've been speaking for a long time. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite you to have a drink, maybe catch your breath. Oh. And I was also wondering if anyone in the audience had a question for Pen.
Don't be shy, I'll answer anything.
And don't all jump at once. Yay! Thanks, Vicky.
Hi there.
Hello.
So I was curious, given that there is less than you would expect applicability in research of biodiversity in the Northern Pole, what are the main moving factors in why the biodiversity research does happen, and who most drives that?
So you're asking why is there not very much research up there?
Well, why the research that is there does happen, even though there's no financial applicability to that, I guess.
I'm sorry,
Why, given that there's not that much nothing can be gained financially,
yeah.
Why is there so much research taking place there?
Well, I think several answers. One is that it is a peculiarly poorly understood and researched environment. Bit of an embarrassment to the international scientific community in one sense, and also a massive opportunity for new bloods to start finding stuff out, because so little is known. And that's really a function of two things, mainly three things. One, it just wasn't regarded as a significant useful area. It was just regarded by everyone until 20 years ago as just a place up there. No one ever goes there, what's the point? Secondly, satellites, the ones that give the sea ice coverage data, they can't see, in inverted commas, north of 88. So there's this hole, if you like, there's no data about sea ice around the North Pole, to within about a 120-mile radius of the North Geographic Pole, which is the point around which the planet spins, marks our axis of rotation in the Northern Hemisphere. And the third reason is ships would just not be able to get in there. It's fantastically expensive. The Europeans, with the Alfred Wegener Institute, sent the Polar Stern up there. It's a socking great research ice-breaking vessel. That project ran for about 18 months, and it cost about $180 million. We're talking serious money, and that involves 600 scientists in rotations during that 18-month period. So you can see it's a very expensive place you know, even now with all our technology and so on, to access. And that's only 600 scientists. Sounds a big number, but that's on one route. You know, it can only sort of look at things where the ship is going. So it's not looking at everywhere else in the Arctic Ocean. So I think those are 3 reasons. So there's a lot of catch-up going on. The ice is going so much faster than all the computer models suggested. There's like a huge effort to catch up and understand what this place is all about and how it relates to the places that you and I do know more about.
Looking back over your career,
Yeah.
what's the one thing you'd have done differently?
Phew. I'm trying to think, because it's definitely not that I've done everything right. I think that I would have, I haven't been asked this for really, I think I would have tried, not really tried hard, I wish, funders of expeditions, which is now like a dying art, there are no flights, there's no aircraft service now that'll take you up to the North Pole from the Canadian side. None. So what I did is not repeatable, basically, just for that reason. And that's because of the sea ice conditions changing and so on, so they can't land on the ice anymore. But I think, what was I going to say? I've lost my thread. What would I have done?
What would you have done differently to what you
Yeah,
actually did?
well, I wish that I could have got funding earlier. British companies seem to take pleasure in, almost, seemed to me, at the other end of the telescope, in funding one as late as possible. So with 3 or 4 months to go, finally, yes, we're going to support you. The Norwegians, the Scandinavians, they're funded 2 years in advance. And so you can, you know, the difference in how you can fund your preparations is massive. People keep, you know, laugh at the British explorers very often, or certainly the Scandis do, thinking, you know, what's wrong with the Brits always failing and losing their digits and making aholics?
So you'd have liked to be more prepared?
Yeah, I'd like to have had more funding, you know, and at the end of the day, my choice has tended to be, well, if I've got enough money to do something, I'll go and I'll give it my best shot. But that's sometimes why it can look a bit ugly and not result in successes.
Over to Crispin.
Mindful of the mental strains that naturally go on when you're on your own for 75 days or whatever, did you find you dreamt differently?
Ultimately, I think the answer to that is no. I'm not a great dreamer. You know, 2 or 3 times a year I remember a particularly vivid dream at home. So no, and I didn't dream particularly. I was virtually unconscious with exhaustion most of the time. So no. But I used to get something, I have something called, what's it called? Leg syndrome. Restless leg syndrome. That's it. Restless leg syndrome. And in the Arctic, in my sleeping bag, it manifests itself as very severe, like electric shocks, like lightning, forked lightning coming up from my toes, the undersole of my feet, up to about here. Fantastically strong spasms that really hurt. There's nothing I could do about it. And we've never really got to the bottom of whether it's a lack of salt or just the nerves warming, most likely the nerves, superficial nerves, thawing in the sleeping bag overnight and then firing up and getting really angry. That, in terms of sleep, that was a horrible issue, especially when it was very cold. And needing to have a wee twice a night. You know, it's the last place on earth, trust me, you want to be getting out of your sleeping bag, although I managed to learn how to do it in my sleeping bag most of the time. Yeah, well, now I don't have to be I don't need to go to the Arctic for that joy. But yeah, that was annoying. There are lots of weird things so many weird things that go on up there with the body and the mind, but not dreaming.
Thank you. And you mentioned a few dates, 89, 2003, I'm sorry, 89, 94, 97, 2003. As you kind of went on that trajectory, did you see technology sort of help with maybe new materials, new lighter equipment, maybe sort of navigational equipment that sort of helped maybe ease the mental load that may have taken a toll?
Yeah, hugely. That's a great question. So the sledge materials went from fiberglass, very heavy, to carbon fiber and Kevlar and other things like that, which, I mean, my sledge, I'm trying to remember now, I think it was, I can't remember now, but it doesn't really matter, but way less than half the weight, just as the empty sledge. For my first 20 years, we had used HF radios that were hand-built with fixed frequency crystals in. So I had the BBC World Service, my air operator's number, another air operator's number, and I can't remember what the fourth one was. But those were the frequencies I could tune into. And then they had to be, and you were using the ionosphere, and it was like seriously unpredictable. And as you approached the pole, you could hardly hear the people you needed to talk to tell them where you were and that you're ready for collection or what have you. Foods improved a bit. We had freeze-dried foods that were fantastic meals, beautifully thought through, and I've cooked them at home with friends, not telling them, and put a knob of butter and some parsley on the top, and because they've been bitching about what an idiot I am to eat all this food for months, and they had no idea at all. I was the first person to ever use a satellite phone that replaced the HF radios from the North Pole, and that was about 1999, I think. And I actually called my wife, who I thought would find this a historic moment. Darling, I'm not known as the world's most, IT techno chap, but you'll be pleased to know this is, a moment in history. And she, of course, I hadn't thought this through as to what the time of day was or night for her. It's about 3 in the morning, and she literally said, I couldn't care less, and put the phone down. So, what can I say?
That's true love, by the way.
That is, yeah, she's frank and honest exchange of views. And there were no doubt other things, but the clothing improved a bit, not massively actually. What I would say though is that, behind that question that is often, so it's not as hard as it was when Shackleton and Scott and Amazon were doing their stuff. You've got it pretty easy these days, let's be honest. Well, I would say what actually happens, 2 things. The first, all of us explorers and extreme adventurers, we take all the advantages that you can offer with new stuff, and we'll take it straight to the far edge again. We're always operating at what I would call the bleeding edge of exploration in terms of what's possible. So it doesn't feel like this is a luxury, and but the other thing I would say is that for the great, heroic figures of the 1800s and early 1900s, when they set off, they often had limited idea of, or no idea actually, of what lay ahead in terms of the terrain or the ice conditions or the land or whether there was going to be serious people. I mean, I would say even scientists and politicians, let me rephrase that. Serious people, minded people. There were quite a lot of people who, until someone actually flew over the North Pole or got to the Pole, thought there was going to be 7 layers, 7 chambers of depth going down into the Earth's core with gold inside. It's like people's minds just go weird when you start thinking about the poles, or they used to. So the stress, I can tell you, the stress of not knowing that on a chart someone's been there. There are no glaciers, there are no crevasses. There's no. It's a game changer. Because when we went our new route to, it wasn't radically new route, but it was a new route, about 70 miles off the starting point of the usual route to the South Pole. It was really stressful. I was really struck. Gosh, why am I? It's that never quite knowing whether you're going to be blocked, and that's the end of the expedition. Just over the next rise. But the biggest thing is in the good old days, they were on their own. The ship would drop them off in Antarctica or on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, and then it would go back to England or wherever, and it would try and come back the next year if the sea ice conditions allowed to get them to where you'd agreed to meet. But there was no radios, no telephones, nothing. And so you had, and sometimes they didn't come back. So to have the mental fortitude to know that through your best efforts were going to be useless, you may never be picked up, or that you would die long before anyone could find you or reach you. And if you broke a leg, you're just going to have to sort it out there. You can't call up an aeroplane and say, do you know what, it's over for me this time. I need to be stretched out. And that is another game-changing perspective.
Thank you. In traditional style, I would particularly encourage if there's any woman who would like to ask a question, particularly since Pen championed women to the Arctic. Do we have a woman who would like to ask a question, or I'll do another one?
Come on, ladies. Excellent. Well done.
Firstly, thank you for your time. Also, your journey is super inspiring. And my question may sound a little bit strange, but given the fact that there are organizations like seed banks or even like data storages in that areas, are there organizations putting the same efforts to avoid any commercial activities in the areas? And also, let's say in 50 years time or 80 years time, where do you think is going to be one of the safest places in the earth, like in case of any war or this kind of situations?
Okay, so I'm so sorry, but I could hear the second question is how have we got military issues building up in the area?
Yeah, as in military issues or even like change of weather and stuff in future, like let's say in 50 years time or 80 years time.
Yeah.
So where would you say is going to be one of the safest places? That's the first thing. And are those organizations like seed banks in the North Pole or like the data storages that they are from those organizations, are they putting the same efforts to stop that activities, like commercial activities in those areas?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so some of you may know that one of the global seed banks that endeavours all commercial crops, seeds certainly, and I think may go broader than that, rather like Kew Gardens in this country. There is a seed bank in Spitsbergen, deep in an old mine shaft. I hear that the samples there, because of warming that's going on, they are beginning to have real challenges that require a lot of money to fix, to keep the temperatures good, to keep these seeds in good condition. And that money is just not coming through at the moment, and it's a lot of money. So that's sort of one answer to your question, one of your questions. I don't think that Russia is going to continue in its expansionist mode for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I think there's a sort of there's an end to that cycle, and that being the case, the next most avaricious nation state is China, in terms of the mineral resources offered by the Arctic Ocean and the sort of natural resources of fish and so on. But that said, and you'll read an awful lot in the papers over the last decade or two, and now there's this. It's all based on these territorial rights claims to the seabed. Okay, right. So to be really clear, it is for the seabed and the subseabed. That's all that countries can claim. They cannot claim more than, they've already got 200 nautical miles up there, you can't claim more than another 150, that's the maximum. And you've basically got to prove that your continental shelf and geology, you haven't got into the abyss, basically, the ocean abyss. So those claims are largely going to be granted over the fullness of time. But the body, and actually it's something called the international seabed, however, the body of water that sits on top of that extra 150 miles is run by a completely different body. So if your ships or your mining ships, oil rigs and mother vessels and all this, if they are not allowed into the water body, go across the top, surface vessels, then you can't access what you thought you had at the seabed. So one of the ways of stopping activities, you don't have to worry about who owns what on the seabed in international waters areas, because you can control the traffic on top of it. Does that make sense? If I was being really dramatic, I would say that the countries that are most vulnerable to military occupation are, in the Arctic are obviously Finland and Sweden and Norway and Svalbard, and possibly the Faroe Isles, and certainly Greenland, and possibly, most of the islands above Canada. They are seriously low-level militarily serviced by their home countries, and it really would not take very much at all to just ping those people out of their 2 or 3 tiny areas. Holding that, knowing what rage that would give NATO is probably the only thing that stops it happening at the moment, I would hazard. But I mean, they're looking to join, Sweden's joining NATO, Finland's joining NATO. Everyone is getting increasingly concerned of the possibilities. But I just don't think things are going to go on long enough in that current expansionist cycle. That's just a personal, not very well-informed view, which I shouldn't really have made public.
In very general terms, are you still hopeful for the Arctic?
There's nothing that we can do in our lifetimes that will slow down the melting of the sea ice. So, because the oceans keep on heating up long after we actually start, even if we start to reduce the absolute amount of carbon emissions in the atmosphere, oceans continue to warm up for hundreds of years. So it does look as though the sea ice is kind of doomed for a substantial period of time. So I don't think we can save the Arctic in that sense, but I do think there is, the pressures are just building up on, over time, politicians, amazingly, and businesses, more particularly, to do the right thing. And I like to think that profits will not, which is actually the legal responsibility to shareholders of most limited companies, I mean, that's the deal, I think are going to be grade and social and economic, social environmental impacts are going to be factored more into their purpose and objectives in a legal framework. And I think once that happens, and as that happens, there are B Corps, as you know already, and all sorts of mechanisms are coming into place. But ultimately, I think it is for global legislators, if you will, global policymakers, set the ground rules, and then it's fair for everybody. If you just get most people to agree to something, they can't, they are going to lose business. They're going to lose their entire business if they're shipping people, if one country is saying, no, we're going to just crack on doing whatever. It can't work. So it's these big global agreements which take a very long time to get through, and that's the big concern. I'm sure they'll get there in the end, but it might be literally at the end, and it's kind of too late. Somehow we need to speed these the processes of getting agreements in place up. It's way too slow, way too slow.
Thank you very much, Pen. If you
Sorry,
yes.
one follow-up to that. Do you see rare earth metals as sort of part of that agreement, that we haven't sort of come to an agreement yet, sort of globally, that needs to be sort of mentioned?
Yeah, I don't really know too much about rare earths per se. I mean, I know there's cobalt and various things on the seabed. I know a bit more about the seabed sort of opportunities for rare earths being hoovered up. The UN body is the International Seabed Authority that is charged with, as the first step, protecting the environments, and then thinking about, once it understands them and the impacts of any mining work, then maybe sanctioning or giving licenses out. But it seems to have gone, it's a new organisation, and I think it went in a rather commercial direction. And now I think I think over 20 countries have now, as political groups, have said, no, this is not on. And so it's finding its feet. But But I don't think there's no reason to believe that the Arctic Ocean, and I would stress the area of greatest concern to me, which is the international areas, where we do have some influence. I can't influence America usefully, what it does in its 200-mile range, or Russia. They're going to do what they want to do. So I think it's pointless, you know, from my point of view, trying to influence that meaningfully. But I've got no reason to believe there's anything special in the Arctic Ocean. I'm sure there are things, but not necessarily at any great scale. So little is known.
Thank you very much, Ben. I have one last question before you leave us. What are you doing this weekend?
Oh dear. I'm picking up a military kayak that's 40 years old. It was used in, the exact model was used in the Cockleshell Heroes, which some of you might know about, which was a sort of 5 teams went out in these 2-man kayaks in the Second World War. And up the French coast. They were taken out of submarines. So they're framed, ashwood framed boats, beautifully sort of skeletal frames that you click together, click, 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 click. So you've basically got what looks like an Inuit kayak, and then you've got a canvas deck and a rubber hull, and you tension it all up. And then I'm going to take that from John O'Groats to the northernmost mainland of the UK, and then I'm going to take it up with my partner, another sailor, mariner, who's my age, and we're going to go across the Pentland Firth, up the Orkney Islands, then up to the Fair Isle, and then beyond to the Shetland Islands, and go to the northernmost rock in the United Kingdom, called Outstack, which is about a mile north of a wonderfully named group of rocks with a lighthouse on it called Muckle Flugger. And Muckle Flugger and Outstack are further, it's 350 kilometres, okay, it's all in British waters. And in fact, you can go 12 miles north, because we didn't get given 200 miles. Every country gets given 12 nautical miles off their coastlines. If you go 12 miles north of Outstack, that's the actual limits of United Kingdom territory in the British Isles. We will be considerably further north than St. Petersburg, Oslo, Stockholm, Helsinki, and level with the southern suburbs of Anchorage, and further north than southern Greenland. The United Kingdom's territories go a great deal further north than nearly everyone imagines, but that's the truth of it. And our point of our expedition is to demonstrate that the Arctic Ocean and some of the actual animals, seals, gulls, and all sorts of things, are moving between the two, between British waters and the Arctic Ocean waters on a sort of annual basis, seasonal basis. And the air that you're breathing now, probably literally this weather, could have been over the Arctic Ocean, over the North Pole 5 days ago, those same molecules. So we're much more integrated with what goes on up there than we've really been aware of till now. So that's my plan.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'll be thinking of you whilst I do my weekly shop at Asda.
Thanks, Vinny.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.